Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The air outside the factory gates was thick with tension. The rhythmic hum of machinery that had once echoed through the industrial district had been silenced, replaced by the murmurs of workers gathered in small clusters, their voices low but filled with determination. The strike had officially begun. For decades, Everton Steelworks had been the backbone of the city. The factory provided jobs, stability, and for many families, an entire way of life. Generations had passed through its gates, men and women alike donning their heavy boots and safety gear, clocking in before dawn and leaving long after the sun had set. But things had changed. Wages had stagnated, hours had stretched longer, benefits had been slashed, and the promises of fair treatment had become nothing more than empty words. The breaking point had come when the company's latest contract proposal demanded mandatory overtime with no additional pay. It was the final insult, the last in a long list of indignities that had pushed the workforce too far. And so they stood together now, refusing to cross the picket line, demanding that their voices be heard. Among them was Samuel Hayes, a seasoned worker who had spent over 20 years in the steel mill. He had watched the company grow, expand, and profit, while the workers had received little in return. His calloused hands clenched the wooden sign he held, the bold letters reading, "Fair pay for fair work." Next to him stood Miriam Evans, one of the younger employees, fiery and outspoken. She had joined the plant only 3 years earlier, but had quickly become a fierce advocate for workers' rights. She had no family legacy in the mill, no deep ties to its past, but she understood exploitation when she saw it. And she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. As the morning light spilled across the pavement, a hush fell over the crowd. The factory doors swung open, and James Holloway, the plant manager, stepped onto the steps. His gaze swept over the strikers, his expression unreadable. Dressed in a crisp suit, he was a stark contrast to the workers, who bore the marks of years of labor in their worn clothes and tired eyes. "I won't keep you long," Holloway began, his voice calm but firm. "This strike is not in your best interest. The company has always treated you fairly, and we expect you to return to work before this escalates." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and anger. Samuel took a step forward. "Fairly," he echoed. "How is it fair to force us to work overtime without compensation? To take away our benefits and tell us we should be grateful just to have a job?" Holloway sighed, as if speaking to a group of children who simply didn't understand. "These are difficult times. The company is making sacrifices, too." Miriam's voice cut through the murmurs. "Sacrifices? You just gave yourself a 6-figure bonus last quarter. Where's our share of that sacrifice?" A few chuckles rose from the crowd, but the anger was real. Holloway's jaw tightened. "If you don't return to work, we'll have no choice but to bring in temporary replacements." There it was, the threat. The murmurs grew louder, the frustration bubbling to the surface. Samuel tightened his grip on his sign. "You bring in scabs, and this strike won't just be about wages anymore. It'll be about respect." Holloway hesitated, then turned back toward the factory. "You have until the end of the week to reconsider." As he disappeared inside, Miriam turned to Samuel, her expression hard. "They won't give in easily." Samuel exhaled slowly. "Then neither will we." The strike had begun, and it was about to change everything. The morning after Holloway's warning, the picket line was even stronger. More workers had joined overnight, bringing their families, friends, and community members to stand in solidarity. The once quiet industrial street now buzzed with the energy of protest. Signs waved in the air, voices rose in unity, and a sense of purpose bound them all together. Samuel Hayes arrived just after dawn, his thermos of coffee clutched tightly in one hand. He had barely slept. The strike weighed heavily on him, not just because of the financial strain it would bring, but because he knew how desperate the company was to break them. He had seen it before, how employers would slowly chip away at a strike, divide workers, turn people against each other. He couldn't let that happen this time. Miriam stood at the front, a megaphone in hand, rallying the crowd with chants. Fair pay, fair work, no more greed, no more perks. The voices echoed down the street, bouncing off the steel walls of the silent factory. The power of their unity was palpable, but Miriam knew that strength alone wouldn't win this fight. A few media outlets had taken notice. Local journalists snapped photos, recording footage of the growing unrest. A young reporter from the Daily Tribune, Jessica Lane, approached Samuel and Miriam as they stood near the barricade. "What do you hope to achieve with this strike?" Jessica asked, holding out a small recording device. Samuel took a deep breath. "Respect. Fairness. We're not asking for luxury. We're asking for what we're owed. We put in the hours, we work in dangerous conditions, and we keep this company running. The least they can do is compensate us fairly." Jessica nodded, taking notes. "There's a rumor that replacements are being brought in today. What's your response to that?" Miriam scoffed. "They think they can scare us into backing down. They don't realize this strike isn't just about money, it's about dignity." As if on cue, a black van turned onto the street, its tires crunching against the gravel. The energy of the picket line shifted in an instant. Every protester turned their eyes to the vehicle as it slowed near the factory entrance. The doors opened, and a group of men in plain work clothes stepped out, temporary workers brought in to replace them. A wave of anger rippled through the strikers. "Scabs!" someone shouted. The tension escalated as the replacements hesitated, clearly uneasy about walking past the crowd. They weren't the enemy, but they were crossing a sacred line. Samuel raised a hand, motioning for calm. He stepped forward, standing in the direct path of the incoming workers. "Think carefully before you cross that line," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't just a job. It's a stand for every worker in this factory, and every worker like us who's been taken advantage of. If you walk through those gates, you're siding with the people who don't care about any of us." One of the replacements, a younger man who looked barely out of his 20s, shifted awkwardly. "I need this job," he muttered, his voice laced with uncertainty. "I have a family to feed." Samuel nodded. "So do we. That's why we're out here." For a moment, it seemed like the replacements might turn away. But then, from behind the factory gates, Holloway emerged, arms crossed over his chest. His presence was a silent order. "Keep moving." One by one, the replacements hesitated, then lowered their gazes and walked toward the factory entrance. The anger in the crowd surged. Some began to shout, others tried to block the path, but Samuel held firm. "Stay peaceful," he called out. "That's what they want, an excuse to shut us down. We don't give them that." Miriam clenched her fists, watching Holloway disappear into the factory. This is far from over. And deep down, Samuel knew she was right. The battle had just begun. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement as the strikers remained steadfast in their positions. The heat of the day did little to break their resolve, but tensions were mounting. It wasn't just the replacements that angered them. It was the blatant disrespect from management, the unspoken challenge that dared them to hold out longer than the company could. Samuel stood near the barricades, his arms crossed, watching the factory gates like a hawk. He wasn't alone. Miriam stood beside him, her usual fire burning in her eyes. "They think this will break us," she muttered. "They don't know what we've been through." A truck rumbled down the street, slowing near the gate. A delivery, one that shouldn't be happening. The company was still trying to keep operations running despite the strike. A few workers shifted uncomfortably, debating whether they should stop it. "Hold your ground," Samuel said firmly. "We don't get violent. That's what they want. We don't give them the satisfaction." The truck's driver hesitated. Clearly, he wasn't comfortable crossing the picket line either. After a long pause, he revved the engine and backed away. A small victory, but one that lifted morale. Then, as if to counteract that minor success, Holloway appeared again. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of corporate executives trailed behind him, their suits pristine despite the dusty streets. They spoke among themselves, throwing occasional glances at the picket line. "They're planning something," Miriam murmured. Samuel nodded. "Probably legal action. Or worse." Holloway stepped forward, clearing his throat. "You've made your point," he announced. "But let's be realistic. This strike won't last forever. We have investors to answer to, production deadlines to meet. The longer this drags on, the worse it will be for all of you. A few of the older workers shifted, their resolve tested by the weight of bills waiting at home. Holloway noticed and pressed on. If you return to work now, we're willing to negotiate a slight increase in wages. But this walkout, it's only hurting you. Miriam laughed dryly. A slight increase? After years of cutting our benefits? After expecting us to work unpaid overtime? You don't get to insult us and call it a gift. The crowd murmured in agreement. Samuel took a step forward. If you were serious about negotiations, you wouldn't have brought in replacements. You wouldn't be trying to run things without us. Holloway's face darkened. The offer won't last forever. You can take it or leave it. But I promise you, if you wait too long, there won't be an offer left. The strikers held their ground as Holloway turned on his heel and walked back toward the factory, his team following close behind. They're getting nervous, Miriam said after a moment. They wouldn't make an offer if they weren't. Samuel exhaled slowly. Then we hold out. We don't let them win. As the factory doors slammed shut, the strikers tightened their ranks. The battle lines had been drawn, and neither side was willing to back down. The night brought little relief from the rising tension. The strikers remained at their posts, their voices softer now but still determined. Lanterns flickered in the dim light, casting shadows on the pavement. Some workers huddled together, sharing quiet conversations, while others remained standing, watching the factory with unwavering focus. Samuel sat on an overturned crate, rubbing his hands together as he scanned the picket line. Miriam joined him, offering a lukewarm cup of coffee. "We need to start thinking ahead," she said. "If they're willing to make an offer now, they're more desperate than they're letting on. But they won't hesitate to wear us down." Samuel took a sip of coffee, nodding. "We need to keep up the pressure. If we give them any room, they'll think they can outlast us. We have to show them we're not moving." A shout broke through the quiet. One of the younger workers, Daniel, was standing near the barricade, pointing down the street. "They're bringing in security." The mood shifted instantly. A convoy of black SUVs rolled toward them, headlights cutting through the dark. The vehicles came to a slow halt just outside the factory gates, and men in heavy boots and uniforms stepped out. Private security, hired muscle meant to intimidate. The lead guard, a thick-set man with a stone-like expression, walked toward the strikers. "This is private property," he announced. "You're trespassing." Miriam stood her ground. "We're on public property. We have a right to be here." The guard didn't flinch. "Disrupting operations is a violation of company policy. If you don't disperse, there will be consequences." Samuel stood, stepping beside Miriam. "What are you going to do? Arrest us for standing? We're not breaking any laws." The guard's eyes narrowed. "That's not up to me. But I suggest you don't test us." The crowd tensed. Some workers gripped their signs tighter, others shifted uneasily. The tension was thick enough to cut through. Samuel knew this was a test, a way to see if fear would drive them away. "We're not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "You can tell Holloway that." The guard held his gaze for a long moment before turning back toward the SUVs. Without another word, he motioned for his men to stand down. The security team remained by the vehicles, but they didn't approach again. "For now." Miriam exhaled, shaking her head. "They're escalating. Next time, they won't just threaten us." Samuel knew she was right. The company was playing its hand, and they weren't afraid to push back hard. He looked at the faces around him, workers who had put their livelihoods on the line for something bigger than themselves. "Then we stand together," he said firmly, "no matter what's coming." The night stretched on, the presence of security looming in the background. But the strikers remained. They had made their choice, and they weren't turning back. The next morning, the tension had not faded. If anything, it had grown sharper. The security team remained stationed outside the factory, their presence a constant reminder that the company had no intention of backing down. But neither did the strikers. Samuel arrived at the picket line early, greeted by tired but determined faces. Some workers had barely slept, their minds racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Others had gone home briefly, only to return at dawn, unwilling to let their absence be mistaken for weakness. Miriam paced along the line, her eyes darting between the workers and the security guards. "They're waiting for us to slip up," she murmured to Samuel. "They want a reason to push us out. We can't give them one." Samuel nodded. "We hold steady. No violence." No breaking ranks. We're stronger together. A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A man in a suit, someone new, someone important looking, was approaching with Holloway at his side. The workers stiffened as the two men stopped just beyond the barricade. "Good morning," the stranger said, his voice cool and measured. "I'm Victor Langston, corporate liaison for Everton Steelworks. I'd like to discuss a resolution." Miriam scoffed. "A resolution? You mean a way to break us apart?" Langston smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I understand your frustrations. Truly. But this strike is hurting both sides. We'd like to find a compromise." Samuel crossed his arms. "Then sit down at the table with us. Treat us fairly. Show us some respect." Langston's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "Unfortunately, negotiations can only happen if operations resume. We can't negotiate while production is halted." "So you want us to cave first," Miriam said. "That's not a compromise. That's a demand." Langston sighed, shaking his head. "I was hoping we could avoid this. But if you continue to block operations, we'll have no choice but to seek legal action. And once that happens, it could take months, years even, before this is resolved. Can you afford that?" A murmur ran through the crowd. That was the company's real weapon, time. The longer the strike dragged on, the harder it would be for the workers to survive. Bills didn't wait. Families still needed food. Samuel could feel the doubt creeping in, the uncertainty. He had to act fast. "We've lasted this long. We'll last longer. You want to test us? Fine. But we're not walking away just because you say so." Miriam stepped beside him. "And if you think threats will scare us, you don't know who you're dealing with." Langston's expression remained neutral, but Holloway was fuming. "This is a mistake," the manager snapped. "You're putting your futures at risk." Samuel held his ground. "No, you already did that when you put profit over people." The workers cheered, their unity strengthening once more. Langston and Holloway exchanged a glance before turning back toward the factory. The message had been sent. As the day wore on, Samuel knew they had won this round. But he also knew the battle was far from over. Because when a company was desperate, it would do anything to win. The sun was barely above the horizon when Samuel arrived at the picket line the next morning. A light mist clung to the streets, the cool air refreshing after a long night of uncertainty. The workers were gathered, their voices hushed but determined, waiting to see what the company's next move would be. Miriam stood with a group near the barricade, scanning the horizon like a soldier preparing for battle. "They're going to push back harder today," she murmured as Samuel approached. "We rattled them yesterday, and they won't let that slide." Samuel nodded, gripping his thermos a little tighter. "Then we need to be ready for whatever they throw at us." It wasn't long before the first sign of retaliation arrived. Another convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the factory gates. This time, a larger force of security guards emerged, more heavily equipped than before. They carried themselves differently, more aggressive, more confident. They had been given a new mandate. Langston arrived shortly after, his expression unreadable as he walked up to the picket line. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice as smooth as ever. "I was hoping today would bring a change in perspective." Miriam crossed her arms. "Funny, we were hoping the same from you." Langston's smile never wavered. "You had your moment to make a statement, but it's time to let this go before it gets out of hand. The company has secured a court order declaring this strike illegal due to obstruction of business. If you do not vacate the premises, law enforcement will be involved." A ripple of anger spread through the crowd. Samuel clenched his jaw. "You think a piece of paper is going to break us? We have rights. You can't just shut us down because it's inconvenient for you." Langston's gaze darkened just slightly. "We have the law on our side. Do you?" The workers stood firm, their faces set in determination. Some whispered among themselves, debating their options. The threat of arrest was real, and many had families depending on them. But giving in now would set a precedent they could never undo. Miriam stepped forward. "If you think we're going to scatter at the first sign of trouble, you've underestimated us. We're not leaving." Langston sighed. "Then I suggest you brace yourselves. Because whether it happens today, tomorrow, or a week from now, this will end. And when it does, we'll see who's left standing." With that, he turned and walked back toward the factory. The security guards didn't move, staying in place as an ever-present warning. Samuel exhaled slowly, then turned to the workers. This isn't just about wages anymore. This is about proving that we won't be bullied. We stand together, no matter what happens next." The crowd murmured in agreement, their resolve solidifying despite the threats. The sun continued to rise, casting long shadows over the factory gates. The fight was far from over, but they weren't backing down. The tension outside the factory gates had reached a boiling point. With the security forces stationed at the entrance and the looming threat of law enforcement, the strikers knew that the next few days would be critical. They weren't just fighting for better wages anymore. They were fighting for their dignity, for their right to stand up against corporate oppression. Samuel stood with Miriam at the front of the picket line, scanning the faces of their fellow workers. Some looked tired, others anxious, but all of them stood their ground. The knowledge that the company had obtained a court order weighed heavily on them, but fear alone wouldn't break them. "We need to be smart about this," Samuel murmured to Miriam. "If they get law enforcement involved, we need to show the public that we're peaceful. They're going to try to paint us as aggressive troublemakers." Miriam nodded. "We stay disciplined. We make sure every move we make is controlled. They want an excuse to break us up, and we're not going to give them one." Before Samuel could respond, a loudspeaker crackled to life. Holloway's voice boomed through the static. "This is your final warning," he announced, his voice eerily calm. "You are in direct violation of a court order. If you do not vacate the premises within the next 12 hours, we will be forced to take action. This is your chance to leave peacefully." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some workers exchanged nervous glances, but no one moved. Samuel stepped forward, raising his voice. "We're not trespassing," he called back. "We have the right to strike, and you can't silence us just because it's inconvenient for you." Holloway didn't respond. The loudspeaker clicked off, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything they had experienced so far. That evening, more supporters arrived. Families, union representatives, and members of the local community showed up with food and supplies, reinforcing the workers' determination. A local news crew set up just across the street, their cameras trained on the picket line. "This is the kind of coverage we need," Miriam said, watching as a reporter prepared for a live broadcast. "If they try to remove us by force, the whole city will see it." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew colder. The workers gathered around makeshift fire barrels, trying to keep warm. Some talked quietly among themselves, others simply sat in silence, waiting for what would come next. At midnight, the sound of engines broke the stillness. Several unmarked vans pulled up near the factory gates, their dark silhouettes barely visible in the dim streetlights. The workers stood up, bracing themselves. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. "Stay calm," he said under his breath. "No matter what happens." The doors of the vans opened, and riot police stepped out, clad in dark uniforms, helmets gleaming under the lights. They carried batons and shields, their presence a clear message. A chilling stillness fell over the crowd. Then, a commanding voice rang out from behind the line of officers. "This is the police. You are in violation of a court order. Disperse immediately, or you will be removed by force." Miriam clenched her fists. "They're really doing this," she whispered. Samuel's jaw tightened. He knew this moment was coming, but seeing it unfold in real time was something else entirely. He stepped forward, just enough to make his presence known. "We are peaceful," he called out. "We are unarmed. We are standing for our rights." The lead officer didn't respond. Instead, the line of riot police began advancing. The workers held their ground, their faces set in determination. Cameras rolled as the world watched. The next moments would define everything. And Samuel knew that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The sound of boots against pavement echoed through the night as the line of riot police continued their slow, methodical advance. The workers stood firm, their hands gripping picket signs and banners as they braced for what was to come. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "We stand together. No matter what happens, we do not strike back. We let them show the world what kind of force they're willing to use against honest workers." The police stopped just a few feet away. The lead officer, his visor lowered, raised a megaphone. "This is your final warning. Disperse now, or we will take action." The workers didn't move. Miriam stepped forward, raising her voice. "We have every right to be here. We will not be intimidated." The officer gave a signal. In unison, the riot police lifted their shields and took another step forward. The tension in the air was suffocating. Cameras from the news crews captured every movement, beaming the scene to thousands watching from their homes. The city was awake now, and social media had erupted with live footage of the standoff. A sudden bang shattered the silence. It wasn't clear who had thrown the first object, a bottle, a piece of debris, but the impact sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. The police seized their opportunity. Shields collided with protesters as officers surged forward. Shouts and screams filled the air as workers scrambled to hold their ground. Some tried to shield themselves, others were dragged away by officers armed with zip ties. Samuel saw Miriam fall, knocked off balance by the force of a baton strike. He rushed toward her, helping her to her feet. Her face was pale, but she was unbroken. "They want us to fight back," she said through gritted teeth. "We can't give them what they want." Samuel nodded, pulling her close. Around them, the strike was turning into a mass arrest operation. Officers were grabbing workers indiscriminately, dragging them toward police vans lined up at the edge of the street. Then, as quickly as it had started, a voice broke through the chaos. "Enough!" The shout came from the far end of the street. A new group had arrived, city officials and union leaders, pushing their way through the mayhem. One of them, an older man in a long coat, held up his hands. "This is being broadcast live. Do you really want the world to see this?" he demanded. The lead officer hesitated. The images were already spreading like wildfire. People were watching from their phones, from television screens, horrified by the brutality. Calls were being made to City Hall, to state representatives. Langston appeared from the factory entrance, his face twisted in frustration. "This is a private matter," he growled. They were given ample warning. The city official turned on him. "It stopped being private the moment you sent riot police after unarmed workers." He gestured toward the cameras. "You think investors are going to like seeing this? You think the board of directors is going to ignore it?" The lead officer stepped back, whispering something into his radio. The orders changed. The police pulled back. The arrest stopped. Some workers were left bruised, others shaken, but they had held their ground. And now the power dynamic was shifting. Samuel wiped sweat from his forehead, breathing heavily. He turned to Miriam, who was clutching a bruised arm. "We're not done yet." "But they just made the biggest mistake of all." Miriam nodded, watching as Langston retreated into the factory. "They showed the world who they really are. Now it's our turn." As the police fully withdrew, the workers regrouped, battered but undefeated. The city was watching, and that meant the fight was far from over. The morning after the clash with the riot police, the strike had transformed from a local labor dispute into a national controversy. News stations played footage of the brutal crackdown on repeat. Commentators debated the ethics of corporate force, and social media buzzed with hashtags supporting the workers. Public sympathy had shifted in their favor. Samuel woke up sore, his body aching from the previous night's chaos. He had barely slept, but as soon as he stepped out of his small apartment, he could feel the change in the air. People in the neighborhood nodded at him in silent support. Some offered coffee or breakfast. The strike had become bigger than just the factory. It was now a movement. By the time he arrived at the picket line, dozens of new supporters had gathered. Community members, activists, students, all standing side by side with the workers. The numbers had doubled overnight. Miriam stood near the barricade, her arms still wrapped from the bruises she had suffered the night before. She gave Samuel a tired but determined smile. "We're winning," she said. "They just don't know it yet." Samuel glanced toward the factory gates. The security team was still there, but something was different. Holloway and Langston had not appeared that morning. The company was on the defensive, and it showed. A few hours later, a familiar car pulled up near the line. Jessica Lane, the reporter from the Daily Tribune, stepped out, microphone in hand. She had been covering the strike from the beginning, but today, she looked more excited than usual. "Big news," she said as she approached Samuel and Miriam. "A major labor rights organization is stepping in. They're calling for a federal review of Everton Steelworks practices." The footage from last night reached some very influential people. "The company is under serious pressure." Miriam exhaled sharply, almost in disbelief. "That's huge. If the government starts looking into their books, they'll have nowhere to hide," Samuel finished. He turned to the crowd. We need to keep the momentum going. This is the moment we've been waiting for. That afternoon, another wave of supporters arrived. More news crews, more community members. Even local politicians, sensing the shift in public opinion, started making statements of support. And then, finally, Langston showed his face. He appeared at the factory entrance, flanked by 2 advisors. He looked tired, less composed than usual. The crowd quieted as he approached. "We're prepared to negotiate," he said, his voice controlled but lacking the arrogance of before. "But only if the strike ends immediately." A murmur ran through the crowd. Samuel stepped forward. "We're prepared to negotiate, too. But the strike doesn't end until we have a fair contract, in writing. We're not backing down based on promises." Langston's jaw tightened. "You're putting people's jobs at risk. The company has limits." Miriam let out a sharp laugh. "The company has millions. We have rent to pay. Get serious." Langston took a deep breath, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he gave a single nod. "A meeting will be scheduled for tomorrow morning. The board is willing to talk." A cheer went up through the crowd. Samuel turned to the workers, raising his voice above the noise. "We don't celebrate yet. We don't trust them yet. But we hold the power now. They know it, and they're scared. We go into that meeting strong." Langston disappeared back into the factory. Samuel looked around at the workers, their faces filled with hope but still cautious. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time it felt like the end was near. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning of the negotiation meeting arrived with an eerie stillness. The streets leading up to the factory were quieter than they had been in days. The energy was different, not the raw anger of confrontation, but the measured focus of a team that knew the battle was now being fought across a table rather than a picket line. Samuel stood in front of a group of workers, addressing them with calm authority. "This is it. This is what we fought for. We don't let them intimidate us in that room. We don't settle for anything less than what we deserve." Miriam, standing beside him, nodded. "They're feeling the heat. They wouldn't have agreed to this if they weren't desperate to make this go away. But we can't trust them. Not yet." A chorus of agreement spread through the crowd. Everyone knew the stakes. They had come too far to leave with empty promises. As the worker representatives, Samuel, Miriam, and 2 other senior employees entered the factory's main office building, the difference between their world and the company's was stark. The boardroom was lined with expensive leather chairs, and the long glass table reflected the cold artificial light above. Sitting at one end was Langston, Holloway, and 3 corporate attorneys. Their posture was stiff, their expressions unreadable. Langston gestured to the seats across from them. "Take a seat. Let's get started." Samuel sat without hesitation, his hands clasped in front of him. "Let's not waste time. What's your offer?" A silence stretched before one of the attorneys slid a folder across the table. "The company is willing to offer a 2.5% wage increase, with an additional performance-based bonus system to reward long-term employees." Miriam scoffed. "That's an insult. We've been underpaid for years. 2.5% barely covers inflation. We're not here for scraps." Langston leaned forward. "It's a significant step forward from where we were a week ago." Samuel met his gaze evenly. "You're not in control anymore. We are. You wouldn't be at this table if you weren't losing. Our demand remains the same. A 10% wage increase, the restoration of full benefits, and an end to unpaid overtime." One of the attorneys shook his head. "That's unreasonable. The company cannot sustain that." Miriam leaned forward. "Your CEO took home $4 million last year. You have the money. You just don't want to spend it on the people who actually make your profits possible." The room fell into silence. Holloway, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "We're not going to be bullied." Samuel's voice was steady. "Neither are we. And we're not walking away without a fair deal." For the next 3 hours, the negotiations were tense, with every number, every demand scrutinized and debated. The company fought to give as little as possible, while the workers refused to compromise on their core needs. The back and forth grew more heated until finally, Langston exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll agree to 7%. No more. We'll restore partial benefits and ensure overtime pay, but not at your requested rate." Samuel exchanged a glance with Miriam. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was far more than they had before. More than they had ever been offered. Miriam tapped her fingers on the table. Full benefits. We don't move without that. Langston hesitated, but the pressure was clear. The company had been backed into a corner. After another long pause, Holloway sighed. Fine, full benefits. But no more increases beyond the 7%. Samuel nodded slowly. Then we have a deal. But one condition, you put it in writing. Now, Langston clenched his jaw, but motioned to his attorney. Within minutes, a formal agreement was drawn up. Samuel and Miriam read every word carefully before exchanging a firm handshake with the company representatives. As they exited the boardroom, stepping back into the sunlight, the gathered workers stood in anxious silence, waiting for news. Samuel raised the signed contract high above his head. A cheer erupted through the crowd. Tears, laughter, relief, all of it spilled over as workers embraced each other. They had done it. After weeks of uncertainty, of fear, of standing in the cold against the forces of corporate greed, they had won. Miriam wiped at her eyes, grinning. They didn't break us. Samuel exhaled, looking at the factory behind them. No, and they never will. The strike was over. But the workers had proven something greater. That together, they were unstoppable. The days following the agreement felt surreal. After weeks of struggle, the workers had finally secured what they had been fighting for. There was an undeniable sense of victory, but also exhaustion. The picket lines, once filled with anger and determination, were now quiet. The signs that had been held high in protest were stacked neatly at the edge of the lot, reminders of what had been accomplished. Samuel walked through the factory gates for the first time in nearly a month. He could feel the weight of everything they had endured, but now there was something new: respect. Workers exchanged nods, their eyes filled with something different from before. They had stood together, and they had won. That wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. Miriam stood at the main entrance, waiting for him. How does it feel? She asked. Samuel exhaled. Like we actually belong here now. They walked through the hallways, past machinery that had been silent for too long. Some areas still had dust from inactivity, but the hum of life was returning. Workers were finding their places again, but this time they weren't afraid. At the far end of the main floor, a notice had been pinned to the bulletin board. New labor agreement signed. Wages increased. Benefits restored. It was a contract that had cost them sleepless nights, but it was real, and it was theirs. As they moved toward their stations, Holloway passed by, his usual authoritative posture somewhat diminished. He didn't say a word, just offered a stiff nod before disappearing into his office. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. Langston, however, wasn't so reserved. He approached Samuel and Miriam near the break room, his expression unreadable. I suppose congratulations are in order, he said flatly. Miriam crossed her arms. Is that an attempt at being gracious? Langston sighed. You got what you wanted. The board wasn't happy, but the company will survive. Let's just hope this doesn't set a precedent. Samuel smirked. It already has. People know their worth now. That's not something they'll forget. Langston said nothing to that, just gave them one last glance before walking away. As the first full shift resumed, Samuel looked around at his fellow workers. There was a quiet strength in the air, a certainty that hadn't been there before. Miriam nudged him. We built something here. Even if the fight's over, we can't let them chip away at it again. Samuel nodded. We won't. If they try, we'll be ready. The factory was alive again, but it was different this time. The workers knew they weren't just employees. They were a force, and they would never be silent again. The weeks after the strike were a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet celebration. The workers had returned to their stations, but something fundamental had changed in the factory. No longer did employees lower their heads when management walked by. They carried themselves differently now, with confidence, with the knowledge that they had forced the company's hand and won. Samuel could feel it in the air every time he stepped onto the floor. Conversations were louder, bolder. People no longer whispered their complaints to one another, afraid of being overheard. They spoke openly, with a newfound sense of authority over their own working conditions. Miriam had become somewhat of an informal leader among the employees. Even those who had hesitated to join the strike now sought her out for advice. She wasn't just another worker anymore. She was a voice for them, a fighter who had shown them what was possible when they stood together. How long do you think this will last? Samuel asked one afternoon as they leaned against a metal railing, overlooking the floor. Miriam exhaled, crossing her arms. That depends on us. They're watching, waiting for us to get comfortable again. The second we stop paying attention, they'll start trying to claw back everything we gained. Samuel nodded. We need to make sure we stay organized. If we let our guard down, it'll be back to how things were. She glanced around at the workers, some of them chatting in groups, others working their stations with renewed energy. They won't forget. The question is whether we'll be ready when they try to push us back down. The changes weren't just among the workers. Management had become quieter, more reserved in their interactions. Holloway had been avoiding the factory floor, retreating into his office like a defeated king in a crumbling castle. Langston, however, was a different story. He had started making rounds, watching, listening. One afternoon, he approached Samuel by the welding station. Things seemed to be running smoothly, he said casually. Samuel kept his expression neutral. They always did. The only difference now is we're getting what we deserve. Langston smirked. For now. But business is about balance, Samuel. You can't expect the company to bend forever. Samuel met his gaze head-on. It's not about the company bending. It's about fairness. We were never asking for charity, just respect. And if we have to remind you of that again, we will. Langston studied him for a moment, then chuckled softly. You've changed. Before all this, you wouldn't have spoken to me like that. Samuel shrugged. Before all this, I thought we had no choice. Now I know better. Langston's smirk faded slightly before he turned away, walking back toward the administrative offices. The message had been sent. Later that evening, Miriam called a small meeting after the shift. It wasn't formal, just a handful of trusted workers sitting around in the break room, discussing the future. We need to think long-term, she said. This wasn't just about a pay raise. It was about showing them that they can't ignore us. But if we don't keep that pressure up, we'll be right back where we started. One of the older workers, Dennis, nodded. We should start thinking about forming an official workers' committee. Something permanent. Something they can't brush aside. Samuel glanced at Miriam. That's not a bad idea. If we have a structure in place, it'll be harder for them to single us out. The group murmured in agreement. A workers' committee would give them leverage, ensure that they had a seat at the table. It wasn't just about this victory, it was about protecting the future. As the meeting broke up, Samuel felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just a temporary fight. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The battle for their rights wasn't over. It was just getting started. The decision to form a workers' committee spread quickly throughout the factory. By the end of the week, nearly every employee had either expressed support or signed up to be involved. The momentum from the strike hadn't faded. It had evolved into something more structured, something more permanent. Samuel and Miriam worked tirelessly to establish the committee's framework. They spent late nights drafting guidelines, organizing meetings, and consulting with union representatives to ensure that their foundation was legally sound. One evening, after yet another long meeting in the break room, Miriam leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. We need to make sure this doesn't just become a formality. If we don't have real power, then this is just a symbolic victory. Samuel nodded. The company will try to play along at first, pretend like they're cooperating. But the second they see an opportunity to undermine us, they will. We need to have clear demands and a way to enforce them. Dennis, one of the older workers who had been there long before the strike, spoke up. I've seen this happen before. Companies pretend to change, but they wait until everyone gets comfortable again. Then they start making small adjustments, cutting back hours, changing policies without notice, replacing people who speak up. It's slow, but it works if we're not watching. Miriam frowned. We can't let that happen. We need elected representatives. People who will meet with management regularly, keep track of every change, and make sure the company doesn't try anything behind our backs. The idea took hold immediately. Over the next week, elections were held among the workers, with representatives chosen from each department. Samuel, unsurprisingly, was voted as one of the primary voices, alongside Miriam and Dennis. The first official committee meeting with company leadership was scheduled for the following Monday. As the date approached, tension within the factory grew. Management wasn't happy about the change, but they knew they couldn't stop it, not without risking another labor crisis. When the meeting day arrived, Samuel and the other representatives walked into the boardroom with confidence. Langston and Holloway sat at the far end of the long table, flanked by 2 legal advisors. They looked as though they had been forced into this against their will. Langston folded his hands on the table, his expression neutral. "All right, let's hear it. What exactly is this committee proposing?" Samuel set a folder down in front of him. "We want regular meetings with management, a structured process for handling disputes, transparency when changes are being made to workplace policies. And above all, we want our voices to count when decisions about this factory are being made." Holloway scoffed. "So you want to run the company now?" Miriam leaned forward. "No, we want to make sure the people who actually keep this place running aren't ignored anymore. If you want workers who are committed to this company, then you need to respect them." Langston exhaled through his nose, flipping through the pages in front of him. "We're willing to agree to structured meetings and transparency in policy changes. But final decisions will always rest with upper management. That's not negotiable." Samuel kept his expression even. "We understand that. But if our input isn't taken seriously, we will have options. Legal options, public options. And you know what happened the last time this company made the mistake of underestimating us?" The room was silent for a long moment. Langston tapped a finger against the table before finally nodding. "Fine. Regular meetings. Transparency. We'll start there. But if this committee turns into a disruptive force, then you'll have to deal with us again," Miriam finished. Holloway's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The power had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. As the meeting wrapped up, Samuel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. They had just secured another victory, not through protest, but through persistence. This wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a foundation. Walking out of the boardroom, Miriam grinned. "This is just the beginning." Samuel nodded. "And now we make sure it lasts." The factory had changed, but it wasn't just the policies, it was the people. The workers moved with a new confidence, no longer walking on eggshells around supervisors or dreading sudden policy changes. The committee had given them something more than just better wages or benefits. It had given them a voice. Samuel noticed it in the way conversations had shifted. Instead of whispering frustrations in dark corners, people openly discussed work conditions, their rights, and what they still needed to fight for. They weren't just employees anymore. They were a collective. But management wasn't done testing them. A week after their first official committee meeting, rumors began spreading that Holloway had been meeting with certain workers in private. It didn't take long for the committee to confirm it. Supervisors had been approaching select employees, offering quiet incentives for them to speak against the committee, to say they felt pressured into supporting it. Miriam was furious. "They're trying to divide us. They can't go after the committee directly, so they're going after the people who might be vulnerable." Samuel sighed. "It's the oldest trick in the book. If they can make it seem like the workers are turning against each other, they win without lifting a finger." Dennis, sitting with them in the break room, shook his head. "We can't let them do this. We need to address it before it spreads. Then we bring it into the open," Samuel said. "We talk to the workers. We make sure everyone knows what's happening. If we let this fester in the dark, it'll grow. But if we shine a light on it, they lose their leverage." The next day, the committee called for a factory-wide meeting. It wasn't mandatory, but almost everyone showed up. People gathered in the break area, sitting on crates, leaning against machinery, waiting for what the committee had to say. Samuel stepped forward. "We've been hearing things. Some of you have been approached by management, told that the committee is dangerous, that speaking out against it will get you special treatment, that if you turn against us, there'll be rewards." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some workers exchanged guilty glances, others looked outright furious. Miriam stepped beside Samuel. "We're not here to shame anyone. If you've been approached, you're not the enemy. You were put in an impossible position. But we need to recognize what's happening. They're trying to break us from the inside because they couldn't break us from the outside." Dennis, standing at the edge of the group, spoke up. "I've seen this before. They make it seem like they're offering something special, but it's just a tactic. They're not giving anyone power. They're using people as leverage. The second they get what they want, they'll drop the ones who helped them." More murmurs. This time, the doubt had been replaced by anger. A young worker near the front, Daniel, spoke hesitantly. I was one of the ones they talked to. They told me if I spoke against the committee, I'd get a raise, that I'd be looked after. But now I see what this really is. They don't care about me. They just want to weaken us. Miriam nodded. That's exactly it. But if we stand together, they can't divide us. And if we let them know that their tactics won't work, they'll have no choice but to actually deal with us fairly. The meeting ended with a renewed sense of unity. The workers knew now what was happening behind the scenes, and more importantly, they knew they had a choice: stick together or be played against each other. By the end of the week, Holloway's little recruitment plan had completely collapsed. No one wanted to be seen as the person who betrayed their fellow workers, not after the open discussion. The committee had solidified itself as something more than just a temporary resistance. It was here to stay. Langston, ever the corporate strategist, made one final attempt at damage control. He called Samuel into his office, offering him a private deal, a promotion, a salary increase, a management position, in exchange for stepping away from the committee. Samuel didn't hesitate. I didn't fight for this just to sell out the people who stood with me. If you think you can buy me off, you haven't been paying attention. Langston's smirk faltered. Be careful, Samuel. You may think you've won, but the company will always look out for itself first. Samuel leaned forward. And now, so will we. As he walked out of the office, he knew this fight was far from over. But one thing was certain: the workers had won a battle that could never be undone. The final chapter of the struggle didn't come with a dramatic showdown or a sudden betrayal. It came with quiet strength, with the realization that the battle they had fought was now a part of history, something that would be remembered not just by the workers in the factory, but by the entire industry. The committee had not only survived, but it had grown stronger. More workers participated in meetings, more voices spoke up about workplace concerns, and the factory floor was no longer a place of silent resentment, but one of cautious optimism. Samuel sat in the break room, sipping his coffee as the hum of the factory filled the background. Miriam joined him, setting down a notepad filled with meeting notes. It's strange, isn't it? We fought so hard for something that now just feels normal. Samuel nodded. That's the point, though. It shouldn't feel like a battle just to be treated fairly. This should be how things always are. Dennis joined them, stretching his back as he sat. I've been here a long time, seen a lot of ups and downs. But I can tell you this. This is the first time I've ever felt like we actually have a say in what happens here. That's worth something. Outside the break room, Langston walked past, his gaze briefly landing on them. There was no smirk this time, no dismissive glare. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the workers had won in a way he never expected. Holloway had been reassigned to a different division, far away from this factory. His replacement, while still a corporate manager, had been forced to acknowledge the power the workers held. Things weren't perfect, but they were different, and different was enough for now. As the shift ended, Samuel walked outside, watching as workers left for the day. Some were smiling, others laughing, small signs of relief that hadn't been there before. He felt Miriam step up beside him. So what now? She asked. Samuel exhaled. Now we keep going. We don't let them take this back. We make sure the next generation of workers doesn't have to fight this battle all over again. Miriam smirked. Sounds like we just signed up for a lifetime job. Samuel chuckled. Maybe, but at least this time, we get to decide how it's done. As the factory lights flickered off behind them, they knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just the end of a fight. It was the beginning of a future they had built together.